I'd like to argue the idea that the idea of open borders is not actually a true libertarian concept. The reason we need to address this is there is a split in the libertarian movement between the idea of whether open borders is the libertarian way or if something other than open borders is the libertarian way. Uh, I'm arguing that open borders isn't libertarian at all. Uh, One of the issues you have to deal with when you're going back and forth with libertarian ideas is to separate the practical from the ideal. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Like, okay, let's say somehow there was enough libertarian sentiment to start passing laws that were libertarian in nature. Okay, you don't instantly get to some kind of utopia overnight. There has to be uh, a level of what order you do things in, what impacts they're going to have. That's a practical viewpoint. It's assuming that libertarians gain some kind of foothold politically and can actually start influencing the outcome of things or actually drive some of the outcomes. Ideal is the idea of what if all libertarian principles were in place at one point. And ideal is important. I like talking from either perspective. Ideal is useful because we got to know what it is we're kind of shooting for. I like to think of the ideal being like a lighthouse on the shore. And we might get pushed out further at the sea, we might work our way in, we might get shoved back and forth, but we can always see the lighthouse and know that's the end destination we're going to, even though if we can't get there as direct as we'd like. Now, one problem I've noticed with the open borders group is they like to mix the ideal and the practical as it suits their argument. So hopefully I can keep those two ideas separate when I'm defending the ground I'm on. Okay, so one of the first things to talk about in terms of practical. Okay, so a lot of the open borders crowd just says, well, open borders now. It's something we can do immediately, something we don't have to implement. Something you don't have to lay down a lot of groundwork to implement, I mean. So the big problem is an influx of people has a very measurable impact on the infrastructure. Schools being one of the big problems. To a certain extent, policing, and part of it has to do with the fact that immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, are functioning almost as a second class of people. Uh, they're afraid to deal with the police, so it means they become uh, easy prey to criminal elements. Sometimes they're actually working in concert with criminal elements. For instance, like they may have made some kind of contractual obligation to a mob-like organization to get across the border, and they may owe that organization for helping them get across the border. Uh, these things just don't suddenly go away by opening up the borders because the infrastructure we have, the welfare, the police, the hospitals, all are there, and they're impacted by people suddenly showing up on our door. Now, the open borders crowd will say, oh, you're saying you're in favor of these things. No, not at all. It's just a matter of fact they're there, and they're not going to suddenly go away when you open up the borders. Opening up the borders will exasperate those problems. In fact, the likelihood is the more you, the worse you make the problem on the infrastructure, the more you're going to turn other people away from the idea of open borders. So the idea of trying to do open borders as the lead-in to solving our immigration issues, uh, essentially you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you're doing a very big disservice to immigrants in terms that you're lumping them into a group of people that the average American is going to start having more and more problems with having empathy for. So, something I talked about in an earlier video was the idea of that there is no hierarchy of rights. All rights are equal, all rights are absolute. So there is a thing, the right to travel exists. It's not a particularly uh, enumerated right. It hasn't been written down in any of our founding documents, but it passes the test of being a right because it is it does not require something from somebody else to make it happen. So yes, you have the right to travel. However, as I said, because there is no hierarchy, there's also this thing called the right of property. If I own property, you can't just walk across it because you have the right to travel. You have to get permission. And if I don't give you permission, you can't cross it. That's an example of your absolute right to travel coming up against my absolute right to property. And that creates the end of travel at that point. So, one of the things we also have to look at is that the government, I mean, okay, libertarians have different ideas on how big government should be and how involved it should be. But for the most part, unless you're an anarchist, uh, we can kind of agree that if government has any role at all, that sole agreed upon function is to protect rights. So if we have a situation where somebody has property along the border and people are crossing that border onto their property and it's beyond their means to prevent trespass, it is the government's responsibility to come in and assist that citizen if they ask for it. I mean, it is their one job, protecting our rights. So let's switch to the idea of the ideal, getting to not the how do we take the first step from where we are forward, but how does it look on the far end? Okay, so the first thing to think of is the border is a jurisdictional boundary. And on one side of that boundary, the government has power, and I'm specifically talking about the international border. On one side, the government has power, and on the other, it doesn't. Okay? It's not actually government property. There's nowhere in our governing documents that says the border belongs to the government. It's at the end of their power. So if we look at the idea of what does the government own or what should it own, well, if we just look at it in constitutional view, by the Constitution, the federal government can only own the area of Washington, D.C., and it can own land purchased or leased from the states for military installations or buildings. Owning land for its own sake is prohibited. In fact, all the land the federal government, owns from the beginning and never distributed to the states is clearly unconstitutional. And a lot of the land it acquired that actually doesn't have military installations on or for the sole purpose of needed buildings is also probably unconstitutional. Now, ideally, libertarians should be against government owning land at any level because the government takes that land out of use of the individual. The individual should have the ability, depending on your views, to either purchase the land, lease the land, or possibly even, in a Lockean way, squat and develop the land. Uh, so if you look at it from the ideal perspective, pretty much all the land along the border would be privately owned, uh, meaning that it's up to the individual owners to decide if they're going to allow trespassing or not. It's not something, sorry, there's a couple of fleas came in through the screen tonight. Uh, the government doesn't have permission to allow people to transit over that border into private property. They can't do it. Now, so what that means is, in order for there to be an open border, the government has to own land along that border that they give permission for people to cross into. And theoretically, they'd also have to have some kind of travel corridors to allow them to transit to where they need to go. I would think most libertarians would disagree with this idea. The government shouldn't have these abilities. So if the government has no land to give people permission to transit the border into, how can there be an open border? Now, there are ways to open up immigration where we can get peaceful people who want to travel here into this country without violating other people's rights. It just doesn't involve crossing a border into somebody else's private property. And we'll talk about some of those other issues in a different video. I just wanted to mention Hans Hoppe very briefly. Obviously, you can see, if you know who he is, you can see his influence on my thought here. I didn't want to make it sound like this is something I'd come up with entirely on my own thinking. Okay, hope to see you again in a future video. Thank you for taking the time to watch.